A pair of trousers tumbled across a desert road. They are khaki, unremarkable, the kind of trousers a high school teacher might wear on a Tuesday. They float in the hot breeze, and then they are gone, swallowed by the pale emptiness on the ground. In the summer of 2008, an Albuquerque man in his 50s drove a recreational vehicle through the New Mexico desert, dressed in nothing but a gas mask and underwear, having just manufactured a batch of methamphetamine of a purity no one in the American Southwest had ever seen before. 2 men were dead. A boy with a criminal record sat beside him in the passenger seat, incapacitated. The man's name was Walter Hartwell White. He was a chemistry teacher. That sentence, "he was a chemistry teacher," is perhaps the most important sentence in understanding what follows. Not because it explains what Walter White became, but because of everything it implies about the distance between who he was and what he chose to turn into. This video is not a cautionary tale, though it could be read as one. It is not a morality play, though morality bleeds through every chapter. It is, as precisely as we can reconstruct it, the complete life story of a man who was given a death sentence and decided, rather than accept it, to become someone else entirely. He chose to descend. And the terrible thing is that at almost every step, when he was offered a way back, he looked at it, considered it, and walked further down. Walter Hartwell White was born on September 7, 1958, in what the available record suggests was a modest household. He was an only child. Before he was old enough to carry the weight of ambition, he was already carrying something else, the memory of a dying father. Walter was barely old enough to remember when his father's health collapsed. The illness was Huntington's disease, a degenerative neurological condition that dismantles the body and the mind simultaneously. That offers no reprieve and no dignity in its final stages. Walter would later describe, with a precision that only makes the memory more devastating, what he saw when he visited his father in the hospital in those last days. He remembered a twisted body, eyes that did not seem to focus on anything, the sharp, aggressive smell of hospital disinfectant, and the sound of his father's breathing, which Walter described years later as like shaking an empty spray paint can. There was nothing in him. That image of a man reduced to a rattling shell lodged itself in Walter's memory and never left. The cruelty of Huntington's disease is hereditary by nature, and Walter was tested for the condition as a child, though the results apparently cleared him. He worked in a cardboard box factory as a teenager to earn money. These are the biographical coordinates of a young man building himself out of very little, in the shadow of a loss that arrived before he had the vocabulary to process it. His aptitude for chemistry was apparent from an early age, and it was this gift that would become the defining architecture of his identity. The one domain in which Walter White was, without question, exceptional. Chemistry, as Walter understood it, was a language for describing the world at its most fundamental level, the interaction of elements, the precise logic of molecular bonding, the way one set of conditions produces an entirely predictable reaction. It was, for Walter, the closest thing to absolute truth that the material world offered. He loved it. Walter White graduated from Caltech, the California Institute of Technology, and went on to work as a chemist at Sandia Laboratories, a major research facility in New Mexico. It was during this period of his life, working in proximity to the Los Alamos National Laboratory, that the trajectory of the next several decades was shaped by 2 events that compounded each other. The first was gray matter technologies. Walter co-founded the company with a fellow scientist named Elliot Schwartz. He was also at the time in a relationship with a woman named Gretchen, who would later become Gretchen Schwartz, Elliot's wife. The precise sequence of events is this. Walter visited Gretchen's family over a 4th of July weekend, encountered the wealth and ease of their world, and left. He walked away from the relationship without explanation. Shortly afterward, he sold his share of gray matter to Elliot for $5,000. The reason he left, which emerged only in fragments over the years, appears to have been an acute, almost paralyzing sense of inferiority in the face of Gretchen's family's prosperity and social standing. Whether this was shame, pride, or some compound of both, the effect was the same. Walter White removed himself from what would become one of the most successful technology companies in the Southwest, eventually valued at billions of dollars, because he could not bear to feel small in the presence of the people who mattered to him. He never acknowledged this. For the rest of his life, Walter maintained a version of the gray matter story in which he had been wronged, in which his contributions had been taken from him, in which the wealth that Gretchen and Elliot accumulated was built on his foundation. The company's own public record does not support this account. But Walter's bitterness was genuine, and it was architectural. It shaped the structure of everything that followed. Years later, watching Gretchen and Elliot on a television interview, comfortable and celebrated, he was reignited as though the wound had never cooled at all. Instead of a laboratory that pushed the boundaries of chemical science, Walter White became a high school chemistry teacher at J.P. Wynne High School in Albuquerque. He taught the same curriculum year after year to students who largely did not share his passion and did not intend to pursue the field. He was not a bad teacher. By most accounts, he was actually a gifted one, patient, precise, capable of genuine excitement about the material. But the distance between where his talents could have taken him and where he had ended up was, in the quiet of his daily life, enormous. He supplemented his teacher's salary with a second job at a car wash, a detail that matters not because of its indignity, though it was indignant, but because of what it reveals about the economic reality of Walter White's life. A man with his intelligence and education, working a second job to make ends meet. It is the kind of thing that accumulates in a person over years, not a single breaking point, just a slow, steady pressure. Walter White met Skylar Lambert the way that certain love stories begin, through a shared, unspoken ritual and a slowly gathering courage to break the silence around it. After his time at Sandia Laboratories, he frequented a diner near Los Alamos, where Skylar worked, initially as a hostess and at the cash register during what was, for her, a summer job. Walter began going in whenever he knew she was working. When business was slow, Skylar would lean against the counter doing the New York Times crossword puzzle, though she'd angle herself so it looked like she was still working. Walter noticed. He started bringing his own crossword. For a period of time, two people sat 10 feet apart in a diner, both quietly working the same puzzle, both pretending it was coincidence. Eventually, Walter caught her looking over at him, and he used that opening, asking about a 7-letter answer, leaning across the professional distance between them, to begin a conversation. He was, by his own later admission, terrible at those crosswords. He rarely finished one. Skylar did them in ink. They married and moved to Albuquerque. Walter eventually took a position teaching chemistry at J.P. Wynne High School. Skylar, who was 11 years younger than him, worked in bookkeeping. She had studied accounting and brought with her a financial competence that Walter, for all his intelligence, did not share in practical terms. Their son, Walter White Jr., was born with cerebral palsy. Their son preferred to go by Flynn among his friends, and he navigated his physical challenges with a resilience that was, if Walter had been capable of seeing it clearly, quietly extraordinary. They lived in a modest house in Albuquerque. There were credit card balances, a second income from the car wash where Walter worked additional shifts, the perpetual low-level financial anxiety of a middle-class American family in the early 21st century. Skylar was pregnant with their second child, a daughter, when the central event of Walter's story began. In the days after his 50th birthday, Walter White was diagnosed with stage 3 inoperable lung cancer. He was 50 years old. The diagnosis came the day after his birthday, September the 7th, 2008. He did not smoke. The prognosis offered a window of perhaps 2 years, optimistically measured. He had a pregnant wife, a teenage son with a disability. Walter Jr. was 15 at the time. A house with a mortgage, medical bills that would immediately begin to multiply, and a life insurance policy that, like most things in Walter's financial life, was inadequate. He sat with that information alone for days before telling his family. What was he thinking in those days of silence? That question is impossible to answer with certainty, but based on everything that followed, it is reasonable to conclude that Walter White sat with his diagnosis and made a calculation, a cold, precise chemist's calculation about what he needed, how much time he had, and what he was willing to do. The event that set everything in motion was, in structural terms, almost absurdly coincidental. Walter White accompanied his brother-in-law, Hank Schrader, a DEA agent posted in Albuquerque, on a methamphetamine bust in the spring of 2008. It was a ride-along, the kind of thing family members occasionally do out of curiosity or boredom. Walter expected to observe a drug arrest. What he got instead was a glimpse of an economy. Among those fleeing the scene of the bust was a young man Walter recognized, Jesse Pinkman, a former student of his from J.P. Wynn. Jesse was 24 years old, born on September 24, 1984. Just weeks after Walter's own birthday fell during that September of 2008. He came from an upper-middle-class Albuquerque family and had, by most external measures, squandered the advantages that background offered. He had been kicked out of his parents' home owing to persistent drug use and had lived with his Aunt Ginny until her death from lung cancer. He had been a poor student, largely inattentive, and Walter had actually failed him in chemistry class. Jesse was now a small-time methamphetamine manufacturer, working with his childhood friend, Emilio Koyama, a man he had known since elementary school, as his partner in a low-level operation. Walter had not thought about Jesse Pinkman in years, but seeing him that day, seeing the small, grimy world Jesse occupied, and realizing what that world represented financially, something clicked into place in Walter's mind with the quiet, irreversible logic of a chemical reaction. Walter White knew how to make methamphetamine, not in the way that most clandestine manufacturers knew, through rough approximation, using pseudoephedrine and cold medicine and improvised equipment. He knew the pure synthesis. He knew the chemistry at a molecular level that most underground manufacturers never approached. He understood what a genuinely high-purity product would look like and how it would be received by a market accustomed to mediocre supply. He approached Jesse Pinkman with a proposal. They would cook together. Walter would provide the chemistry expertise. Jesse would provide access to the distribution network he already operated in. They would use a mobile laboratory, a recreational vehicle, and they would produce a product of unprecedented purity. The profits would solve Walter's financial problem before he died. Jesse's initial reaction was, understandably, skepticism. He was being approached by his former chemistry teacher, a middle-aged man in khaki trousers, with a proposition to enter a criminal partnership. It was an unusual pitch, but Walter was persuasive, or perhaps desperate, which in practice looks similar, and Jesse agreed. The first cook took place in the New Mexico desert, and it produced something remarkable: methamphetamine of approximately 99% purity. To contextualize that number, street methamphetamine in the American Southwest at that time typically ranged from 50 to 70% purity. What Walter White produced was not just a better product, it was a categorically different one. But the first cook also produced consequences that Walter had not fully calculated. When Jesse went to sell through his existing distribution contact, Domingo Gallardo Molina, known on the street as Crazy 8, who was both Jesse's distributor and an informant for the DEA, he brought along Emilio Koyama, Jesse's childhood friend and co-producer, who had just made bail from a recent arrest. Emilio recognized Walter from the DEA ride-along and concluded incorrectly that Walter was working with law enforcement. In what followed inside the RV, Walter, trapped with no weapon and no obvious exit, did what a chemist does. He identified the materials available to him and synthesized a solution. He created phosphine gas, a highly toxic compound, and killed Emilio Koyama with it. Crazy 8 survived the initial gas exposure and was now imprisoned in the basement of Jesse's house, chained to a support pole, while Walter recovered from a panic attack, and Jesse dealt with the logistical nightmare of an improvised captivity situation. Walter decided that Crazy 8 needed to die, that releasing him was too dangerous, that the man would identify them and they would be killed. He spent days bringing food down to the basement, talking with Crazy 8, learning about him as a person, that his father owned a furniture store on Manal, that he had a life that extended beyond the identity he wore in the criminal world. And then he strangled him with a bicycle lock. The distance between Emilio's death and Crazy 8's murder is the distance between reaction and decision, between what you do when you have no choice and what you do when you choose. Walter White, with full knowledge and deliberate intent, murdered Domingo Molina. The methamphetamine that Walter produced was, owing to a specific chemical precursor he used, methylamine, rather than the pseudoephedrine typically used by amateur manufacturers, a blue color, not sky blue or powder blue, but a pale crystalline blue that was utterly unlike any product then circulating in New Mexico. This visual distinction became a brand marker, though Walter did not intend it as one. On the street, the product became known simply as Blue Sky, or occasionally Blue Magic. The purity remained extraordinary. Batch after batch came out at or near 99%. In a market where product quality was highly variable and often unreliable, Walter White's methamphetamine was immediately distinguishable and immediately sought after. This had a predictable economic consequence. It attracted the attention of people who controlled the existing distribution infrastructure in the region, people who did not welcome competition. The Albuquerque methamphetamine trade in 2008 was not a disorganized affair. It was, in fact, a carefully stratified industry with supply chains, territorial agreements, intermediaries, and enforcement mechanisms. At its apex, though that apex was not yet fully visible to Walter or Jesse, was a distribution organization of considerable sophistication, run through legitimate business fronts, and operating with a discipline more characteristic of a corporate supply chain than of the street-level drug trade most people picture when they think of this subject. Walter and Jesse began selling through Jesse's existing contacts, small-time distributors who were themselves low in the hierarchy. But the quality of the product attracted upward attention faster than either of them anticipated. At the moment he walked into Tuco's headquarters and threw that crystal of fulminated mercury onto the floor, Walter White chose a name for himself. He called himself Heisenberg, a name drawn from Werner Heisenberg, the German theoretical physicist who formulated the uncertainty principle, the quantum mechanical proposition that the position and momentum of a particle cannot both be precisely known at the same time. The act of measuring one inevitably disturbs the other. It was the first time the name was spoken aloud, and it was spoken in a room full of smoke and broken glass by a man who had just demonstrated he was willing to blow things up. Whether Walter White was making a deliberate intellectual statement or simply choosing a name that sounded formidable is not entirely clear, but the choice is resonant in a way that repays examination. The uncertainty principle is, at its core, about the limits of knowability, about the fact that the act of observation changes the thing being observed. Walter White, who is in the process of constructing an entirely new identity, chose to name that identity after a principle of fundamental unknowability. Heisenberg could not be pinned down, could not be fully measured, could not be reduced to a single knowable quantity. That was the point. It was a character that Walter began to inhabit with increasing commitment and, eventually, with increasing preference over his own identity. He was a criminal of the first order, operating with cold calculation and absolute confidence. He wore a black pork pie hat, an article of clothing that Walter White the teacher would never have worn. And he carried himself differently. He spoke differently. He made decisions that Walter White could not have made. This duality, Walter White and Heisenberg, existing in the same body, the same house, the same family, is one of the central psychological features of the story. And it is worth noting that the people around Walter, particularly Skylar, were not entirely fooled. They could see that something had changed in him, long before they understood what had changed. The first major criminal figure Walter and Jesse encountered above their own level was Tuco Salamanca, a distributor who ran the Salamanca family's methamphetamine operation in Albuquerque's South Valley territory. Tuco was the nephew of Hector Salamanca, a senior figure in the cartel structure, and he operated the local distribution network with a volatility that everyone around him regarded as occupational hazard. He was psychotic in the specific way that sustained drug use and unchecked violence produces, unpredictable, capable of sudden explosions, and brutal in proportion to his moods rather than to any rational calculation of consequence. Jesse's initial attempt to approach Tuco's organization for distribution, using his friend's existing connection to the network as an introduction, ended with Jesse being beaten badly enough to require hospitalization. Tuco took the product, beat Jesse, and kept the money. It was predation. Walter's response to this was to walk into Tuco's headquarters, identify himself as Heisenberg, and detonate what he told Tuco was a pound of methamphetamine, but was in fact fulminated mercury, a shock-sensitive explosive he had synthesized and concealed in a bag. He threw a crystal of it onto the floor, and the resulting explosion destroyed the office and rattled everyone in it. Walter then walked out with the money owed to them, plus compensation for Jesse's injuries. This was a calculated display of dominance, using the one advantage Walter reliably possessed over everyone in the room. He understood what things were made of, and they did not. It worked. The encounter established Heisenberg's reputation almost instantly. It also locked Walter and Jesse into a distribution arrangement with Tuco, which, given Tuco's instability, was not an entirely desired outcome. Shortly thereafter, Tuco beat one of his own employees, a man called No Doze, to death in front of Walter and Jesse for the offense of speaking out of turn. Walter watched a man die for saying two words Tuco did not like, and he continued to do business with Tuco because he had no immediate alternative. Tuco's tenure as their distributor ended when Tuco kidnapped Walter and Jesse with the intention of taking them to Mexico to serve as permanent chemists for the cartel supply chain. At a remote desert location where Tuco had brought his uncle Hector, who was by this point incapacitated and communicated only through a bell attached to his wheelchair, a confrontation unfolded in which Tuco was shot by Jesse and then found by Hank Schrader, who had been independently following a lead. Hank killed him in the desert. The near miss of Hank's investigation getting too close was the first of many occasions on which Walter's family connection to the DEA created both cover and extreme danger. Hank was a good agent. He was also Walter's brother-in-law. That tension would persist and eventually detonate at the center of the story. After Tuco's death, Walter and Jesse spent a period in a kind of criminal limbo, capable of producing an extraordinary product, but without access to distribution infrastructure at the scale their volume required. This changed through an introduction brokered by Saul Goodman, a criminal defense attorney of considerable moral flexibility, who became a central figure in Walter's support network. The introduction was to Gustavo Fring. Gus Fring was, on the surface, a model citizen. He was the proprietor of a chain of fast food chicken restaurants called Los Pollos Hermanos, a legitimate business with community ties and a philanthropic presence. He donated to the local DEA field office, was publicly associated with charitable work, and cultivated a persona of the industrious, civic-minded small business owner. He was meticulous, soft-spoken, and possessed of a stillness that could read as calm, but was in fact something more closely resembling absolute control. He was also one of the most significant methamphetamine distributors in the southwestern United States, operating under the supply arrangements of a Mexican cartel while carefully maintaining independence. His distribution network moved product across multiple states with the efficiency of a logistics company because in almost every operational sense, that is what it was. Gus Fring did not trust Walter White immediately. He was a cautious man, and Walter's volatility, his history with Tuco, the sheer unpredictability of his arrival in this world, was not the profile Gus preferred in a business associate, but the product was undeniable. Walter's blue methamphetamine was, in pure chemical terms, the best product on the market. Gus Fring was a businessman. Eventually, the product won the argument. Jane Margolis was Jesse Pinkman's neighbor, and eventually his girlfriend. She was the daughter of Donald Margolis, an air traffic controller, and she was a recovering addict, clean for over a year when Jesse moved in next door. And she made Jesse, for a period of several weeks, genuinely happy. That last detail matters. Jesse Pinkman did not accumulate happiness in large quantities. Jane Margolis gave him some, and Walter White watched it happen with something less than enthusiasm. Walter's unease about Jane was not entirely irrational. She was a destabilizing influence on Jesse, and Jesse's stability was operationally important. When Jesse relapsed, drawn back into heroin use through a combination of his own vulnerability and Jane's eventual slide back into using, the partnership between Walter and Jesse deteriorated rapidly. Jesse was unreliable, absent, consuming product rather than selling it. Jane, aware of the money Walter owed Jesse from recent cooks, began pressuring Walter to pay up, and when Walter resisted, she threatened to expose him. She knew enough, she had leverage, and she used it. Walter paid, but the situation deepened. Jesse and Jane were planning to run, to take the money and go to New Zealand, to start something new, to escape the entire architecture of the life they were both trapped inside. It was, from Jesse's perspective, a genuine plan for survival. From Walter's perspective, it was the dissolution of the only partnership that sustained his operation, and, more pressingly, the departure of the one person who knew enough about Heisenberg to destroy him, if the relationship ever soured. On the night that Walter went to Jesse's apartment to try to reach him, to pull him back from the edge of this plan, he found them both unconscious from heroin use. He went into the bedroom and shook Jesse to try to rouse him, and in doing so, accidentally rolled Jane onto her back. Heroin users who lose consciousness on their backs face a specific risk. If they vomit, they cannot clear their airway. Jane Margolis began to choke. Walter White stood over her and watched. He did not intervene. He did not call for help. He watched Jane Margolis asphyxiate and die, and then he left. The deaths Walter had been responsible for, up to this point, had at least the architecture of self-defense or operational logic. Emilio came at him with a weapon. Crazy 8 would have killed him, if released. The murders that followed were terrible, but they had the internal logic of a man who believed his survival required them. Jane Margolis was no threat to Walter's life in that room. She was a young woman who was unconscious. She was dying in front of him, and he chose to let her die rather than save her, because her death was convenient. The word convenient is the most honest word available here. Walter did not plan to kill Jane. He did not go to that apartment intending what happened. But when the opportunity presented itself, when her death became available to him as a solution to a problem, he took it. He stood there and he calculated, and he chose. That is what makes Jane Margolis the moral watershed of Walter's story, even more than the murders that followed, because those murders required action. This one required only stillness, only choosing not to move. Jane was 27 years old. Her death destroyed 2 people in addition to herself. Jesse Pinkman never fully recovered from it. He blamed himself. He had been lying unconscious beside her. He had relapsed with her. He had brought heroin back into her life after over a year of sobriety. And now, she was dead. That guilt became the undertow of everything Jesse did and felt for the remainder of the story. He sought oblivion through drugs, through increasingly dangerous situations, through a passivity about his own survival that read less like recklessness and more like a man who had concluded he deserved bad outcomes. Walter knew the truth. He knew it was not Jesse's fault. He said nothing. The other person destroyed was Donald Margolis, Jane's father. He had, shortly before her death, reconnected with her. A careful, loving reconciliation between an estranged parent and a daughter fighting to stay clean. The kind of recovery story that people are supposed to get to finish. He did not get to finish it. Donald Margolis returned to work as an air traffic controller weeks after his daughter's death, still in acute grief, and made an error, a catastrophic lapse of attention, that caused 2 commercial aircraft to collide over Albuquerque. 167 people died in that collision. The wreckage rained down over the city. Walter White found a charred pink teddy bear in his backyard pool, the remnant of a child's toy from one of the planes, and could not understand what it was or where it had come from. The chain of causation from Walter's stillness in that bedroom to 167 people dying in the sky above Albuquerque is nebulous. Donald Margolis made his own choices. The grief that impaired him was his own grief, and grief impairs people in ways that cannot always be predicted or assigned. But the chain is real. Walter White let Jane Margolis die, and a man lost his daughter, and that loss eventually killed 167 strangers, and the debris of one of those strangers' belongings landed in Walter White's backyard pool, and Walter could not connect it to himself. That disconnection, the inability or the refusal to trace consequences back to their source, was perhaps the most dangerous thing about Walter White. He was a chemist. He understood cause and effect at a molecular level. He simply declined to apply that understanding to his own actions. The arrangement that evolved between Walter and Gus Fring represented a categorical change in the scale of Walter's operation. Gus had constructed, beneath an industrial laundry facility in Albuquerque, a state-of-the-art methamphetamine laboratory. The facility was equipped with industrial-grade equipment, climate control, ventilation, and chemical storage that would have been the envy of a legitimate pharmaceutical manufacturing facility. It was reached through a concealed elevator, operated with professional discipline, and produced product on a scale that dwarfed anything Walter had previously attempted. Walter and his new lab assistant, a professional chemist named Gail Bedecker, who had been recruited by Gus independently, began cooking in the super lab on a contract basis. Gail was, by all accounts, a genuinely good person, a passionate chemist, an intellectual, a man of eclectic and enthusiastic interests, who was probably too idealistic about the people he was working for. He admired Walter's chemistry unreservedly. Their professional relationship, in better circumstances, might have been a genuine collaboration between equals. Instead, Walter had Gail killed. The logic, as Walter constructed it, was as follows. Gus Fring intended for Gail to learn the synthesis sufficiently well that Walter would become expendable, that the super lab could continue to function without him. Walter recognized this correctly as an existential threat to his survival, and so, before Gus could move against him, Walter directed Jesse Pinkman to Gail's apartment. Jesse, who was many things but not a willing murderer, shot Gail in the face in his own home. Gail was an innocent man, in the sense that matters most. He was not a violent criminal. He had not threatened anyone's life, and he died because Walter White did a calculation and decided that Gail's death was preferable to his own. This is one of the clearest moral markers in Walter's story, a moment when the human cost of his choices fell on someone who did not deserve it at all. Walter's relationship with Gus Fring, always transactional and tense, was further complicated by the broader dynamics of the cartel structure Gus operated within. The cartel, based in Mexico and represented by figures including Don Eladio Fuente and the Salamanca family, had claims on Gus's operation that Gus was in the process of methodically dismantling. The backstory between Gus and the cartel ran deep, and it was personal in ways that pure business logic could not explain. Decades earlier, a young man named Maximino Arciniega, Max, Gus's partner in both their chemistry work and their ambition to propose a business arrangement to the cartel, had been executed at Don Eladio's poolside compound. It was Hector who pulled the trigger on Don Eladio's orders as a demonstration of power, a message to Gus that the cartel did not negotiate with people who arrived uninvited with product samples and proposals. Gus had survived that day only because Eladio found him too valuable to kill. Gus had then spent the following decades building the infrastructure, the relationships, the patience, and the financial leverage to avenge it. Walter was ultimately drawn into this personal war when Gus required a chemist to travel to Mexico to demonstrate the synthesis to cartel chemists. And when the sequence of events at the cartel compound led to Don Eladio and his lieutenants dying from poisoned tequila, Gus poisoned himself as well, knowing he would survive the quantity he had consumed, and walked to the pool where Maximino had died. The cartel was functionally destroyed in that afternoon. But what it meant for Walter was that Gus Fring had lost his most important reason to maintain the partnership. The cartel threat, The primary reason Gus needed Walter's extraordinary product quickly and at scale was gone. Walter's usefulness had a new ceiling, and Gus began to plan accordingly. The investigation that would eventually unmake Walter White did not begin with Walter. It began sideways, through an instinct that Hank Schrader could not fully articulate, and an institution that would not validate it. Hank's suspicion of Gustavo Fring was for a long time entirely personal. The DEA did not share it. The relationship between Gus and the Albuquerque field office was warm. When Hank raised questions about Los Pollos Hermanos, he was met with skepticism bordering on institutional resistance. His colleagues were not inclined to entertain the notion that a man who funded their fundraisers was running methamphetamine across the Southwest. Hank pushed anyway, both his own best asset and worst liability. Stubborn enough to pursue a thread his institution had abandoned, but operating outside official sanction, limiting what he could do with what he found. He placed a tracker on Gus's car. He surveilled the factory. He accumulated observations that built, piece by piece, into a picture he couldn't yet prove, but increasingly couldn't dismiss. Walter knew. He was close enough to Hank, present at ride-alongs in the same family orbit, to see when Hank was working a lead and understand, from the questions he asked and how, where it was pointing. This created a situation of almost geometric complexity. Walter worked for the man Hank was investigating. If Hank succeeded, Gus would be arrested or worse. If Gus learned that Walter's DEA brother-in-law was threatening his operation, Walter's usefulness would become liability. And Gus was not a man who kept liabilities around for sentiment. Walter's response was characteristic. He managed it. He needed Hank's investigation to stall without visibly stalling it, while keeping Hank close and trusting enough that Hank wouldn't stumble onto the truth about Walter himself. Their social intimacy was both cover and vulnerability. Any moment where Walter registered as strange to a man trained to notice strangeness could collapse everything. For a period, Walter fed Gus information about Hank's movements, and fed Hank just enough to keep him feeling productive without letting him find anything that couldn't be contained. He ran a disinformation operation against both men, not through elaborate deception, but through precise management of what each person knew and when. He understood human behavior well enough to anticipate what each would do if given a particular piece of information. The tension crystallized when Hank got too close. Gus's response was measured and unambiguous. Walter's family connection to the DEA was a problem requiring resolution. The implication was not subtle. Walter was expected to manage Hank. The alternative was permanent. Walter intervened by tipping Hank to a development in a separate cartel case, real information he possessed through proximity to the criminal world, buying time and redirecting investigative energy. It worked. What this reveals about Walter is what the story had been building toward. He was genuinely extraordinary at manipulating people who trusted him. Hank trusted Walter. Skylar trusted Walter. Jesse trusted Walter. Gus, in the limited way Gus Fring trusted anyone, accepted Walter as a partner. Walter used every one of those relationships as a resource, giving just enough in each direction to keep the architecture standing while extracting what he needed. The irony is that Hank's instincts were correct. He had found the thread and was pulling in the right direction, stopped not by any failure of his own, but by the quiet interference of a man he ate breakfast with on Sunday mornings. Walter White, later spoken of as the man who brought down Gus Fring, was also the man who extended Gus Fring's operation by months by keeping his brother-in-law looking slightly the wrong way. He was on both sides of that investigation simultaneously, and for longer than it should have been possible, no one saw it. The endgame between Walter White and Gustavo Fring is a study in two very different kinds of intelligence operating at maximum intensity against each other. Gus Fring was a planner of extraordinary patience and foresight, a man who had spent decades on a single project. Walter White was, in the parlance of chess, a tactical genius rather than a strategic one, capable of improvisation and brilliance in the immediate term, but often creating new problems faster than he solved old ones. The proximate cause of Gus's death was the Salamanca family, specifically Hector, who hated Gus Fring with a fury that 30 years had not diminished. Walter, understanding that the DEA was monitoring Gus closely and that a conventional attack was impossible, found a way to convert Hector's hatred into a weapon. He arranged for Hector to be escorted to meet with DEA agents, knowing that Hector, whose hatred of Gus ran 3 decades deep, would never actually inform on anyone, but that the meeting itself would register in Gus's intelligence network as a potential betrayal. The optics of a Salamanca walking into a DEA building were enough. Gus, learning that Hector had apparently cooperated with federal agents, went to the nursing home personally to kill him. He needed to see it done himself. That was his error. Hector was waiting. Attached beneath his wheelchair was a pipe bomb that Walter had constructed. When Gus entered the room, Hector looked at him, holding his gaze for the first time in years with something that read, in the moment before the detonation, as satisfaction. Hector rang the bell on his wheelchair one last time. Gustavo Fring walked out of that room, straightened his tie, and then died. The image, a half-destroyed face, a careful gesture, and then collapse, is one of those narrative moments so precisely constructed that it achieves its effect through sheer incongruity. With Gus Fring dead, the superlab was destroyed by Walter and Jesse. An empire that had operated for years, that had distributed millions of dollars of product across the Southwest, was gone in an afternoon. Walter White had removed the most powerful criminal figure he would ever encounter. He was, in the immediate aftermath, triumphant. He called Skylar from the parking lot of the hospital. The line he delivered, the assessment of his own situation in that moment, became, in retrospect, one of the most important things he ever said, that he had won. He was wrong, but he didn't know it yet. Skylar White knew something was wrong with her husband long before she knew what was wrong. This matters. She was not an oblivious spouse who failed to notice changes. She was a perceptive, intelligent woman who noticed the changes clearly and was systematically misled, gaslit, and controlled by a man who had become very good at deception very quickly. Walter's lies to Skylar in the first year of his criminal activity covered a remarkable range of subjects. He lied about his cancer treatment. Specifically, he refused a fully funded treatment option offered by his former gray matter colleagues, Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, without telling Skylar why, constructing a story about the money's source when she discovered it. He lied about where he went at night. He lied about his financial situation. He constructed secondary lies to cover the inconsistencies in primary lies, and then tertiary lies to cover those. When Skylar discovered the truth, or the first layer of it, her response was not to turn Walter in. It was more complicated than that. She had a newborn daughter. She had a son with special needs. She had a terminally ill husband whose criminal activity had, by the time she discovered it, generated enough money to pay off every financial anxiety she had ever had. She was complicit in the silence, and she knew it, and it destroyed something in her. Her eventual decision to actively participate in the money laundering operation, taking over the books at the car wash Walter purchased as a front business, was not an enthusiastic choice. It was the choice of a woman who had decided that if she could not stop what was happening, she would at least control what she could control. This is a thoroughly human response to an impossible situation, and it is worth acknowledging without excusing. The relationship between Walter and Skylar became, over time, one defined by fear. Not the sudden acute fear of a violent threat, but the chronic ambient fear of living with a man who had demonstrated that he was capable of almost anything, who was becoming more unpredictable and more dangerous, and who no longer seemed to be the person she had married. She moved her children out of the house. She attempted to send them to stay with Hank and Marie. She maintained the business front because she believed rightly that if the money laundering fell apart, it would expose the family to criminal prosecution. Walter White Jr. was a teenager who adored his father, not uncritically in the way of young children, but in the way of a young man who had watched his father face physical limitation and financial difficulty and had concluded that his father was, fundamentally, a decent and admirable person. His mother's more complex relationship with Walter was not yet visible to him. He had constructed an image of his father that was worth protecting, and he held to it with the kind of loyalty that makes eventual disillusionment especially brutal. The revelation of who his father actually was would cost Walter Jr. something that cannot be recovered. By the time the truth was undeniable, he had gone from a teenager proud of his father's cancer survival to a young man who told that same father to stay away from the family and not call again. The distance between those two positions, crossed in roughly 2 years, is one of the most concentrated examples of what Walter's choices actually cost. Their daughter Holly was born during the period of Walter's most intense criminal activity. She spent her infancy in a house that was, in structural terms, a crime scene, a place where enormous quantities of drug money moved through, where a man was being slowly consumed by a persona he had invented, where her mother was operating under conditions of psychological duress that no child should be born into. Holly White was, in the end, the most innocent person in the story, with the least say in any of it. With the superlab gone and Gus Fring dead, Walter found himself in an interesting position. He had the expertise, the reputation as Heisenberg, the connections to Saul Goodman, and a new potential partner in Mike Ehrmantraut, Gus's former head of security, a deeply experienced ex-police officer and fixer who had worked for Gus for years and whose competence and moral code, such as it was, made him one of the most formidable figures in Walter's orbit. The new venture, a three-way partnership between Walter, Jesse, and Mike, required a new laboratory setup and, critically, a new supply of the methylamine precursor that produced the blue product's distinctive purity. This led to a train heist, the hijacking of a freight train carrying methylamine through the New Mexico desert, which was executed with considerable ingenuity and succeeded in transferring a large quantity of the chemical to their storage. The heist was witnessed by a child on a dirt bike, a boy named Drew Sharp, who had ridden out into the desert and happened to be in the wrong place to see men in the wrong act. Todd Alquist, a young man they had recruited as extra labor for the operation, shot Drew Sharp and killed him. Walter and Mike's reactions to this were different. Jesse was devastated in a way from which he never fully recovered, but the operation continued. This is the detail that matters most. The operation continued. Drew Sharp's death is one of the most significant moral data points in Walter's story, not because Walter pulled the trigger, but because of what it reveals about the culture Walter had created. He had built an operation in which people calculated that killing a child witness was the rational response to a security problem. Walter had not told Todd to do this, But Walter had created the conditions in which this calculation was made, and after it was made, Walter chose to keep going. The partnership between Walter, Jesse, and Mike was always uneasy. Three people with fundamentally different priorities and personalities, bound together by economic logic. Mike's principal concern was the welfare of his granddaughter and the financial provision of the former Fring employees who were now in legal jeopardy from the DEA's investigation into Gus's operation. He was a pragmatist, a professional, a man who would do what needed to be done without drama or self-deception. A buyer emerged who wished to purchase the entire methylamine supply for a fixed sum, a deal that Mike and Jesse supported as a clean exit from the business. Walter refused. His reasoning was that he would not walk away with less than what he believed he was owed. The identity of Heisenberg had become, by this point, inseparable from Walter's sense of himself. He was building something, an empire, in his own word. The idea of selling out and walking away was not acceptable to him, regardless of the financial terms. Mike represented, in this moment, the clearest possible mirror of what a pragmatic criminal looks like, compared to what Walter was becoming. Mike had no illusions about himself or his work. He did not construct grandiose narratives about pride and legacy. He wanted to provide for his granddaughter and exit cleanly. Walter's refusal to allow this put Mike in an impossible position. Mike's death came later, in a moment of startling impulsiveness. Walter, pursuing a list of names of former Gus employees that Mike possessed, confronted Mike as he was preparing to flee. In an argument over the list, Walter shot Mike with a gun he had seized. He did it in anger, immediately recognized it was unnecessary. The information he needed could be obtained another way, and sat with Mike as he died by a river, offering what was, under the circumstances, an absurd apology. With Jesse increasingly destabilized by guilt and Mike dead, Walter's operation was restructured around Todd Alquist and, eventually, Todd's uncle Jack Welker and Jack's white supremacist gang. This transition represents the final phase of Walter's criminal career, and arguably the nadir of it. Todd Alquist was a young man of alarming blankness. He was not sadistic in the theatrical sense. He did not appear to enjoy cruelty for its own sake. He was simply without the normal human resistance to cruelty that most people carry as a baseline. He killed Drew Sharp without what appeared to be significant internal conflict. He carried out instructions with the same cheerful efficiency, whether those instructions involved chemistry or violence. He admired Walter, worked hard to earn his approval, and was, in Walter's own assessment, a surprisingly competent cook. Jack Welker's crew provided muscle, security, and ultimately, in Walter's most paranoid and dangerous moment, the elimination of a perceived threat in a form that Walter had requested and would spend the rest of his life regretting. Hank Schrader had been pursuing the mystery of the blue methamphetamine for years. He was a good agent, sometimes reckless, sometimes driven by ego, but fundamentally skilled and persistent. He had come closer to the truth on multiple occasions, had even encountered Walter White at crime scenes and in conversations, and had not seen it. This was the fundamental cognitive difficulty of reconceiving someone you love as something monstrous. The discovery came in a bathroom. Hank was using Walter's bathroom at the White family home. On the back of the toilet tank, he found a book, a copy of Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass, inscribed with a dedication to Walter from Gail Bedecker. Hank had read Gail's laboratory notes. He recognized the handwriting. Hank Schrader understood in that bathroom that his brother-in-law was Heisenberg. He went home, he sat with it, and then he confronted Walter directly, in Hank's garage with a recording device running. Walter's response to that confrontation is one of the most carefully documented exchanges in this story. He did not collapse or confess. He acknowledged nothing definitively. And then, in a statement that has been analyzed, debated, and returned to repeatedly, he told Hank that he should tread carefully, that the cancer was back, that he was not long for the world, that whatever Hank thought he knew, the best thing for everyone was to let it go. It was, in its way, a genuine offer. Hank could walk away. The secret would die with Walter, and the family would be protected. Hank, as a law enforcement officer and as a man of principle, could not accept this. The confrontation between them was irreconcilable from this moment forward. Jesse Pinkman had been Walter's partner, his student, his surrogate son, and his victim. The relationship between them is one of the most complex in the story, genuinely affectionate in some moments, brutally exploitative in others, never quite honest. Walter had manipulated Jesse repeatedly, withholding information that affected Jesse's safety, leveraging Jesse's emotional vulnerabilities, and, most damagingly, arranging the poisoning of Jesse's girlfriend's young son, Brock, using a plant-derived toxin that mimicked symptoms of a more serious illness, in order to manipulate Jesse's behavior during a critical period of the Gus conflict. Jesse eventually learned this. The precise mechanics of how the truth reached him involved the same Saul Goodman, whose services they had both employed, and it detonated in Jesse's mind with the force of everything that had been building for years. Jesse had grieved, had struggled with addiction, had tried multiple times to exit the business and failed, had been brought back each time by a combination of Walter's persuasion and his own inability to construct a stable life outside the partnership. Now he knew, and his response was to try to burn Walter's house down. He was stopped by Hank, who had intercepted him and saw in Jesse's unraveling an opportunity, a witness, a partner, someone who could help build a case against Walter from inside. Jesse and Hank's alliance, two people with vastly different positions and motivations, united only by their damage at Walter's hands, became the primary mechanism by which Walter's world finally came apart. Hank's plan to arrest Walter in the desert, a location Walter had agreed to meet Jesse at, unaware that Jesse was cooperating with Hank, very nearly worked. Walter arrived, realized the trap, and attempted to call it off. When this failed, when he saw that he was going to be arrested by his own brother-in-law, with Jesse Pinkman as witness, he made a phone call. He called Jack Welker's crew. What followed in the New Mexico desert was a massacre. Jack's crew arrived and killed Hank Schrader and his DEA partner, Steve Gomez. They did so despite Walter's attempt at the last moment to stop it. But the outcome was 2 federal agents dead in the desert, and Walter was there when it happened, and his phone call had made it happen. Jack Welker's crew took Jesse Pinkman as a slave chemist, keeping him alive because his cook, while not Walter's equal, was still valuable. Walter watched this happen. He also, in his final act of cruelty toward Jesse, told him about Jane Margolis, Jesse's girlfriend who had died of a heroin overdose years earlier, while Walter stood by and watched, refusing to intervene, because Jane had become, in Walter's calculation, a destabilizing influence on Jesse. Walter told Jesse this, in the desert, as Jesse was being taken. It was not necessary. It served no purpose. It was simply cruelty. The aftermath of the Desert Massacre moved very quickly. Within hours, Skylar White was under DEA investigation. The White family home was the center of a criminal proceeding. Walter, understanding that he had perhaps days before law enforcement closed in, activated an escape plan through a man known in criminal circles simply as the Disappearer, a vacuum cleaner repairman named Ed Galbraith, who, for a very large sum of money, could construct a new identity and relocate a person entirely. Walter White became Mr. Lambert and was deposited in a remote cabin in rural New Hampshire. The cabin had no internet, limited heating, and was miles from the nearest town. Ed Galbraith would visit monthly with supplies and news. Walter was essentially in solitary confinement, voluntarily, in exchange for survival. This period is one of the least dramatic in Walter's story, and perhaps the most revealing. Stripped of his empire, his family, his identity, and his purpose, Walter White sat in a cabin in the New Hampshire winter, with a barrel of money that was becoming progressively useless, and a cancer that was progressing toward the end. He grew weak. He grew thin. He grew his beard back, reverting in some physical sense toward the man he had been before all of this. He saw news reports about the investigation into Heisenberg. Walter White walked to a bar in the nearest town, ordered a drink on his last birthday, called his son, and tried one final time to reach through to his family to offer money to repair something. His son told him to die. The call was traced. DEA units were dispatched. He saw an interview with Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz, his old gray matter colleagues, in which they distanced themselves from him and from his achievements, attributing the brilliance of their company to themselves, rather than to any contribution Walter had made. This, predictably, detonated something. Walter White left the bar and drove back toward Albuquerque. Walter White returned to Albuquerque with 3 objectives, as best they can be reconstructed. First, to transfer his remaining money to his family through Elliot and Gretchen Schwartz as intermediaries, using the threat of hired killers, who were, in actuality, Badger and Skinny Pete holding laser pointers in the Schwartz home, to ensure the money was delivered to Walter Jr. on his 18th birthday. Second, to kill Jack Welker and his crew. And third, though Walter did not know it at the time, to free Jesse Pinkman. Whether he consciously framed it this way or not, these 3 objectives collectively represent something like an attempt at accounting, not restitution, which was beyond his power, but a reckoning with what he owed and what he needed to close before the cancer finished him. The mechanism Walter constructed for killing Jack Welker's crew was characteristically precise and characteristically excessive. He mounted an M60 machine gun in the trunk of his car, attached to a motorized rotating mount, and a remote triggering mechanism he built himself. The weapon, when triggered, would pivot in an arc through the car's body, covering the sweep of fire he had calculated to hit targets grouped in a specific location. Walter had designed it to be activated remotely from a key fob, allowing him to be at a distance when it fired. In the event, the spray of fire caught him as well. A fragment struck him in the side during the discharge. He was bleeding when it ended, though he was still functional. He also prepared a vial of ricin, a biological toxin he had synthesized from castor beans early in his criminal career, and maintained for years as a contingency weapon. The ricin was never used in the way Walter originally intended. Its final recipient was Lydia Rodart Quayle, a Madrigal electromotive executive who had been a critical supply chain link in both Gus's and Walter's operations, and who had, after Walter's flight, continued operating the blue methamphetamine distribution through Todd's manufacturing, and had moved to have Walter killed. Walter slipped the ricin into her stevia packet at a cafe meeting. She would not know she was dying until symptoms appeared. The confrontation at Jack Welker's compound was, in technical terms, a success. The machine gun mechanism worked. Most of Jack's crew were killed in the initial burst of fire. Walter himself was hit by a bullet fragment and bleeding, but functional. In the aftermath of the firefight, he found Jesse Pinkman, emaciated, traumatized, chained. A man who had been held as a slave chemist and who had watched Andrea Cantillo, the woman he loved, shot in front of him as punishment for an escape attempt. Walter killed Jack Welker. Todd Alquist was killed by Jesse. Strangled with the handcuff chain Jesse had been kept in a moment that was simultaneously terrible and, from Jesse's perspective, the first act of genuine agency he had exercised in months. Walter and Jesse faced each other on the ground of the compound, Walter bleeding, Jesse free for the first time in what felt like forever. Walter slid a gun toward Jesse. Jesse understood the implication. He picked it up and pointed it at Walter. Walter told him to do it. He said he wanted Jesse to do it. Jesse looked at the wound in Walter's side, understood that Walter was already dying, and refused. He put the gun down. He told Walter to do it himself. He got in Todd's car and drove away. The compound gates opened and Jesse Pinkman drove through them, screaming, not in pain, but in something more complicated than that. Release. Grief. The specific sound of a person who has been through more than a person should go through. Walter White, bleeding and alone, walked into the super lab Todd had built on the compound grounds, a laboratory filled with the familiar equipment of his chemistry work, the fume hoods and gas lines, and the clean geometry of a serious chemical workspace. He moved through it slowly, trailing blood, his hand touching surfaces with something that looked like tenderness. When law enforcement arrived, Walter Hartwell White was already dead on the laboratory floor. He had died from his gunshot wound. He was 52 years old. Walter White was responsible, directly or indirectly, for the deaths of more than 100 people during the 2 years of his criminal activity. These included law enforcement agents, cartel figures, criminal associates, and, most damagingly, people with no direct involvement in his enterprise who simply existed in proximity to it. The aggregation of them into a number has the effect of making them abstract, and they were not abstract. They were people. The methamphetamine that Walter White produced entered distribution networks that stretched across the Southwest and, through Gus Fring's infrastructure, into markets far beyond New Mexico. Methamphetamine is a profoundly destructive drug. Every gram of it that Walter cooked with such pride in his extraordinary purity was a gram that contributed to addiction, crime, family destruction, and death in communities he never visited and whose inhabitants he never considered. The scale of that harm is impossible to precisely quantify, which is its own kind of horror. Walter's family was destroyed in the specific way that proximity to hidden secrets destroys families, not through a single rupture, but through the slow contamination of everything. Skylar White faced criminal investigation, public humiliation, and the loss of the life she had built. Walter Jr. lost his father twice, once to the revelation of who his father actually was, and once to his death. Holly White grew up without a father. Throughout his story, Walter White offered various explanations for why he did what he did. The cancer and the financial pressure of his diagnosis was the initial stated reason, and there is no reason to doubt that it was genuinely part of it. But the cancer was paid for. Treatment was offered and funded by people who wished him well, and he refused it. The money was accumulated far beyond any rational provision for his family's security, and he kept cooking. Walter said once, in a moment of unusual transparency, that he did it for himself, that he was good at it, that it made him feel alive. This is the most honest thing he ever said about the question. And it is the answer that makes Walter White such a particular kind of tragic figure, not a victim of circumstance, not a man driven entirely by external necessity, but a man who discovered in a criminal enterprise the sense of agency, mastery, and identity that his legitimate life had failed to give him. This is not a comfortable truth. It would be easier if Walter White were simply a desperate man who made terrible choices under impossible pressure. He was that, in the beginning. But he became something else. A man who chose Heisenberg over Walter White, who preferred the power and the fear and the pride to the safety and the ordinariness and the love that were available to him. His wife and children were available to him. His life was available to him. He chose not to live it. He was not a violent man in the ordinary biographical sense. Nothing in his history before the diagnosis suggested a capacity for the things he did. The chemistry teacher who taught AP students about electron configurations did not seem to carry inside him the man who watched Jane Margolis die without intervening. And yet, the same man did both of those things. This is the fact that resists easy narrative resolution. We want transformation stories to be either redemptive or cautionary. Either a man becomes better, or he serves as a warning. Walter White is both and neither. He was not redeemed. He did not save himself or the people around him. He died in a laboratory that was not his, having accomplished a series of objectives that were, at best, gestures toward accounting for what he had taken. But he also, in the very last moments of his life, told the truth to Schuyler in a brief encounter that was simultaneously a goodbye and a confession. In chemistry, a catalyst is a substance that accelerates a reaction without being consumed by it. Walter White's cancer was meant to be a catalyst, the thing that set a reaction in motion. But catalysts are not supposed to be consumed by the reactions they start. Walter was consumed entirely. By the end, there was no Walter White left to speak of, only the residue of a man who had burned himself up in his own reaction, leaving behind a debris field of money and bodies and a family trying to figure out how to live with what he had done to them. He was a high school chemistry teacher. He was a brilliant chemist. He was a manufacturer of extraordinarily pure methamphetamine. He was a husband and a father. He was a killer. He was, by his own accounting, a man who had, for the first time in his adult life, done exactly what he wanted to do. Those things were all true at once, and the inability to reduce them to a single clean narrative is, finally, the most honest thing that can be said about Walter Hartwell White.